Welcome to Topic 1 of the CSS full course, an introduction to CSS. In this topic, we'll get a good understanding of what CSS actually is and learn the various methods for how we can include CSS in your web pages. Don't forget that all the complete HTML and CSS coding files, presentation slides, and summary cards from this topic and all the other topics in the full course can be downloaded from the description below. Let's kick things off by exploring how to style and design web pages with an introduction to CSS. We'll be discussing what is CSS, the CSS Box Model, CSS Properties, and CSS Rules. So first up, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Cascading is how to style an element when several rules apply. There's a bit of theory to get through to fully understand what this means, which we'll be looking at in a later topic. Style is about the various styles that can be applied to HTML elements. And finally, we have sheets that refer to their own documents which can be linked to HTML files. So what does CSS do? CSS is used to control the presentation and layout of HTML. We've looked at HTML already, which is all about content. CSS is all about the visual styling of the content. And the next section we'll spend a lot of time on is JavaScript. These three languages, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, are the foundation of front-end web development. Let's take a look at the power of CSS by looking at our Quill application with just HTML. For those of you joining me for the first time, Quill is the major project we are working on inside the bootcamp, and this is where we got up to at the end of the HTML section. You can see it is just the content. At the end of this CSS topic, the Quill homepage will look like this. I'm sure that you can agree with me, it's chalk and cheese, comparing the web page with CSS and without it. Now, an important concept we need to discuss straight away is the CSS Box Model. CSS views every HTML element as if it has its own invisible box around it. Let's take a look at our Quill application and fill in all of these invisible boxes around the content, starting with the logo in the top left corner. Although if I were to trace the perimeter of the icon and text, it wouldn't be straight. All CSS sees is a box around the edges of the content, in this case the image tag. We then have boxes around the navigation links, which are anchor tags. There is a box around the main heading, which is an H1 element. There is a box around the paragraph text, which is a paragraph element. And then again, we have boxes around these links, which are anchor tags. In addition to content elements, structural elements also have boxes around them, like the navigation semantic element and the section semantic element, as well as the span element. We can easily see these boxes whenever we use DevTools. I'm going to right-click, Inspect. I'm going to click the Inspection tool and go and click on some boxes. Let's start with this heading, the H1. You can see a blue box appears around the content. Same with the paragraph and all the anchor tags. This blue box is the CSS Box Model in action. Now these invisible boxes will either be block or inline. We have already covered this concept in the HTML section, but it's worth recapping because it is critical to understand it when working with CSS, and it can be a bit confusing when first starting out. All HTML elements are by default either a block or inline element. Let's first look at block elements. Block elements always start on a new line. We can represent block elements like this. Block elements always take up the full width of a page. Some examples of block elements are headings, paragraphs, unordered lists, and list tags. Now let's look at inline elements. Inline elements do not start on a new line, unless they're after a block element. This is because the block element extends the full width, so it pushes the inline element onto a new line. We can represent inline elements like this. Inline elements only occupy the width of their content. Some examples of inline elements we've seen include anchor tags, images, a line break, and input tags. Knowing whether an HTML element is a block or inline element is crucial, as it significantly influences CSS styling and layout. Let's go and update this image and distinguish between the inline elements and the block elements. I'll keep the block elements in red and update the inline elements to be green. The logo is an image tag, which is an inline element, so we need to update that. The anchor tags in the navigation bar are also inline, so we'll update that to green. We also have a set of anchor tags in the hero section, so those also need to be updated. Finally, the span, which is a container element used to style text, is also inline, so that needs to be updated. From the outset of CSS, I want you to get comfortable with thinking in terms of block and inline elements. It will make your CSS journey a lot easier. Let's go and check out some block and inline elements. I'm going to open up DevTools, and I'm going to click the inspector icon. Looking at this paragraph first, we can see the blue box extends the full width of the page, and the paragraph text starts on a new line. This is typical behavior of a block element. If we look at the image over here, you can see the blue box is only extending the width of the content. This is also typical behavior of an inline element. Now looking at these anchor tags here, again, the content of the anchor tag is only extending the width it needs, because it's an inline element. So why then is this learn more appearing on its own line? Shouldn't it be appearing next to get started? We discussed this in the HTML section, and the reason this is happening is because the anchor tags are wrapped by list items, which are block elements. You can see the list item is extending the full width of the page, which is then pushing down the next list item, which extends the full width of the page. And the anchor tag is inside that list item. You can see that in the markup here. We have an anchor tag inside the list element. So just be aware that nesting can influence the behavior you'd expect. You might remember at the start of the HTML section, I used this PowerPoint slide of my top 5 best things on the internet as an analogy to explain HTML. I now want to extend this analogy to show you how CSS can influence styling. The first thing we'll do is identify the block and inline elements. I'll have this key at the top with block elements in red and inline elements in green. The heading is an H1, so it's a block element. The paragraph is also a block element. Over here we have an ordered list, which is a block element, and each list item within the list is also a block element. And finally, the image on the left is an inline element. Now let's add some structural elements. I'm going to convert this to gray because I'm going to be adding more layers on, and it's going to be a bit much to leave it all in color. First, we'll add a div to group together the heading and the paragraph text. And then I'll add a section to group the image and list. Both are block elements, so are in red. You could of course use other suitable structural tags. I've just chosen these two to show you can mix the generic div container with semantic elements. I'm going to then add the final element, a span, to wrap the text the funniest things, as we will be styling that text differently to the others in the paragraph. A span is an inline container, so it is in green. So next up, we're going to look at CSS Properties. This is how we actually style our HTML. I'm going to split what CSS does for us into 3 overarching categories. The first category is styling we can do to content. This is stuff inside the box. This includes properties like font size, font weight, and background color. It's all stuff within the box. Now, there are a lot more, but let's look at some common content-based properties. And we're going to see this in action on the PowerPoint slide. The first thing we can do is switch up the font family to change how the text looks. Then there's font styling, where we get to play with making text bold or adding an underline. Next, we'll change the font color. Watch as the headings turn blue and the funniest things in the paragraph switches to purple. Quick reminder, we are able to change the color of the funniest things because we have a span we added to wrap this text. We can also change the font size. I've applied this to the heading, so watch as it reduces in size. The final property I will be applying is background color, which I will add to the unordered list. So now that we've had a look at the content, next up is the box. These properties are to do with the box itself. By this, we mean CSS allows you to style box properties with things like width and height, border of the box, and margin, which creates space around the box. Let's see these in action inside PowerPoint. Here's where we left off before. Let's add some borders around the image. You can see it here in green. Next, I'll apply margin below the paragraph text which creates extra space between the paragraph and the listed image below it. We can also play with the box size, which allows us to modify how much space the box takes up. Watch as the image shrinks in size and the width of the list reduces. The last major category is layout. Layout is about where the boxes go on the page. Properties controlling layout include flexbox, which allows us to place elements in one dimension, along a row or column. Grid, which allows us to place elements in 2 dimensions, in rows and columns. And position, which allows us to specify the precise location of elements. Continuing on from where we left off, watch how we can totally transform the layout with grid. We've essentially created 2 columns. Now, this layout looks fairly terrible, but it showcases the power of CSS to move and rearrange boxes. So let's now look at CSS Rules, which is how we go about writing CSS. It all starts with what's known as a selector. Selectors is a topic in itself, which we will be looking at a lot of detail later on. For now, a selector does what it sounds like. It selects the HTML we want to target to apply styling to with CSS. The most simple selector is what we call the element selector, where we just reference the element we want to select and style. In this example, I am selecting all H1s on the web page. Next, we add curly brackets, like this, which will enclose the styling rules. I'm going to add 2 styles that hopefully will be fairly intuitive to understand. But seriously, don't worry about the actual styles for now. We will be covering them all in great detail throughout the CSS section. I'm first going to add a style to change the size of the font, which has the notation font-size. This is known as a CSS property. The property is always followed by a colon. We then give the font size property what size we want it to be. In this case, I want it to be 20 pixels, which I write as 20px. This is called the value, and it always ends with a semicolon. We can apply multiple properties inside these curly brackets. Another example would be changing the color of the H1 element to blue, which I would do like this. It follows the same structure as font size above. The property is color, and the value is blue. Let's now zoom out and get a grasp of some of the terminology we are going to be using in CSS. The combination of a property and its value is called a declaration. Multiple declarations inside the curly brackets is called a declaration block. And this whole setup forms what we call a CSS rule for the H1 element. Before we finish up, I want to set some expectations with CSS. The first point to consider is the size of CSS. There are a lot of properties and values, but CSS is many, many times larger than HTML. You don't need to worry about learning them all. I honestly don't know all of them myself. It's fairly common to always be looking these up on a resource like MDN to remember exactly what the property is and how it works. The second aspect is theory. Mastering CSS theory is key to understanding why elements are styled the way they are. Compared to HTML, CSS requires you to have a deeper theoretical understanding of how things work. The third expectation is that CSS can be fiddly. I say that because getting layouts to look how you intend across all devices can be challenging. Although it may not seem so, it's actually fairly challenging to get a layout to look exactly how you want it to. Beyond just the complexity of how the rules work, you also have to have your CSS cope across different devices, which can be a bit of a pain. So let's finish up by starting to build the summary card for this topic. Introduction to CSS. We looked at CSS Properties, which control the styling of HTML elements. We saw how each HTML element has an invisible box around it, and that the boxes are block or inline, which is incredibly important from a CSS perspective. We saw how there were 3 main categories of CSS styling. The first was the content, what is inside the box. The second was the box itself, like width and height. And the third was where the box goes, like a grid layout. We then spoke about CSS rules. Here is the rule we looked at. We saw a selector is what we use to target an HTML element. We then added curly brackets that contain the styles we are applying. The styling is set by a property, in this example color, and a value, in this case blue. A combination of property and value is called a declaration, and multiple declarations are called a declaration block. Next, we'll dive into how we add styles to our web page by different methods for including CSS. We'll be looking at inline CSS, internal CSS, and external CSS. So first up, let's look at the different methods for including CSS in our HTML document. There are 3 methods for including CSS. The first one is inline CSS. The second one is internal CSS. And the third one is external CSS. It's important to note that inline and internal CSS are generally not recommended. However, it's essential to go through them as they are methods you should know about. External CSS is considered best practice, and this is the method we'll be using in our Quill project. First, let's take a look at inline CSS. Inline CSS is when styling is applied directly to individual HTML elements. As an example, let's take a look at these H1 tags with the text "Welcome aboard." Inside the heading opening tag, we can introduce a style attribute, which is just an HTML attribute. The style attribute can contain a CSS property and value. In this example, color is the property and blue is the value. You can see that there's just one property here, but you can add multiple properties to the style attribute. Now, using the inline method means that styles have to be duplicated for each element, which is not considered a good practice. The reason is because there are going to be many HTML elements on the page that will have similar styling rules. For example, maybe we want all our text to be blue. That would mean every single text element would need to have this style attribute, with the color property set to blue. Now, first of all, that would be a huge pain to repeat that over and over again. And then imagine if we had to go and update our color, we would need to update the value in possibly hundreds of places. Now in this course, I'm using VS Code as my text editor to write code, and Google Chrome as the browser to render our code. You'll need to download both of these tools to follow along with me, and I've posted links in the description below to download each of them. If this is your first time using a text editor like VS Code, and you want to learn a bit more about what it is, then you can check out the video appearing in the top right now, which gives a more detailed walkthrough. So let's jump into VS Code and see how inline CSS works. Alright, so I've gone ahead and set up 2 simple HTML documents. The first is index.html. It contains an H1, an H2, a paragraph, and an anchor tag. The anchor tag here is referencing this page, download.html, to download the summary cards from the bootcamp. You can see this page is over here, download.html, and for now it just contains an H1. Both of these HTML files are contained inside a folder called including CSS. So let's go ahead and add the style attribute that we just saw before. I'm going to go inside the H1 and grab the style attribute. Let's add the color property and set its value to blue. And then I'm going to add another property by just hitting space, and let's go get font size. Now, as I'm getting this, I want to show you that there's also smart built-in tools to VS Code for CSS. As I'm typing the property I want, you can see VS Code is suggesting some, and I don't even need to type it perfectly correct. I can continue typing SIZ without a hyphen, and VS Code still knows what I'm talking about. So let's grab this property and set a font size of 40 pixels. I'm going to hit save, and let's check this out in the browser. So you can see in the browser that the H1 is now blue and a fair bit larger because I made the font size 40 pixels. Now, as I mentioned before, if we wanted to apply this style to other elements, like say the H2, I'd have to copy and paste this and add it to the H2. Let's save and refresh. And you can see now the H2 has the exact same styles as the H1. So inline CSS is not a good option. Let's move on to the second method for including CSS, which is internal CSS. Internal CSS works by styling a single HTML document using the style element. Let's see how this works. Here you can see I have a set of head tags. If you recall, the head section contains information that is not displayed on the web page. Things like the title tag, and meta tags. Inside the head tags, we can add style tags. And just to highlight, these are tags, not attributes, like we saw previously for the inline CSS. In the style tags, we can add a CSS rule with the same notation we saw earlier, using a selector like h1, curly brackets, and then adding our declarations. Now, this is an improvement from inline CSS, because now styles can be defined once and will apply throughout the document. The problem is styles have to be duplicated for each page. This method is not recommended because most projects will have many HTML files. So for example, if you had a project with 100 HTML documents, you would need to replicate the CSS rule for the h1 100 times. So we still have the same issue, where we need to create this rule 100 times across each page, and then if we wanted to update anything, we'd have to go and update it 100 times. Let's go and add internal CSS in VS Code. Alright, so I'm back in our index.html file. The first thing I'm going to do is just remove these styles we added before. So inside the head, I'm going to go grab the style tags. So let's first style the h1. I'll select it and add our curly brackets. And I'll give it the same style as before, color blue, and font size 40 pixels. While I'm here, I'm also going to go add another style for our paragraph. To do this, it's typical to add a line break, and then I'll select our tag like before. I'll grab the paragraph element by typing P and add our curly brackets. Let's give it a color of green and a font size of 25 pixels. Now before we jump in the browser, I'm going to go add another paragraph just so you can see how internal CSS works. I'll grab the paragraph tags and I'll just type the text, "The cards are great." So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see our h1 is still blue, being defined by this CSS rule here. And you can also see that every paragraph on the page is now green with a font size of 25 pixels, which is being defined by this CSS rule here. So that is good. We're defining the style we want for our paragraph once, instead of on every single paragraph element like you'd have to do with inline CSS. However, we have a small problem that when we go look at the other page inside our project, download.html, which has an h1, you'll see that no styling is applied. So you can see that this is a problem. The styling we're applying on our index page is not being carried across to other pages. And that's because the CSS rule is being defined only on the index.html page. The styling is not present on this page. Now, this is also not a good solution. It's because we want to be able to set our styles in one location for all our pages, so that it's easier to manage our styling rules. So let's now look at the third method, external CSS. Here, styles are in a separate CSS file and linked to the HTML documents. Let's see how this works by looking at an index.html page. Inside the head tags of the HTML file, we add a self-closing tag called link. The link has two attributes. The first is rel, which defines the role of the linked resource. It specifies the relationship between the HTML document and the linked resource. For CSS, we use the value of style sheet. There are other values that can be used for rel. For example, the value of icon is used for a favicon, that little icon that appears in the tab of your browser next to the web application. Honestly, I just wanted you to know what they are in the context of CSS. There are other values, but style sheet is by far the most used value you'll see and use. The other attribute is the href attribute, which we've met before when discussing hyperlinks. The purpose of the href attribute is to reference the location of the CSS file, which will be somewhere inside our working directory. So we will be using a relative URL path. Now it's common to call your CSS file app.css. So I will do the same here. And you can see our href is referencing this file. In this example, inside the app.css file, we are selecting the h1 element and applying the color property with the value blue. Now with external CSS, our styles are centrally managed from one file. This is good practice. All we need to do now is that whenever we add a new page is reference the same style sheet, by including the link element in the head of the page. For example, the register.html page would have the same link. And so too with the login.html page. All these pages are referencing the same app.css file. So in this method, we create a single file that sets the style for elements, allowing multiple pages to reference a unified style sheet. So let's jump back into VS Code and add a style sheet to our project. I'm first going to go and remove the style tag. I'm then going to go inside our working directory, including CSS, and create a new file by right-clicking and clicking New File. And I'm going to call this app.css. Inside the app.css file, let's first go and add the h1 again. We'll do color blue and font size 50 pixels. I'll then add a paragraph. We'll give it a color of red and a font size of 30 pixels. Now, if we were to open up the HTML file in our browser, we wouldn't see any of these styles being applied. And that's because the app.css file is currently not linked to any pages. So let's go link them now. I'm going to jump into index.html. Now, I generally like my title element to come last in the head, so I'm just going to scoot this down. I'm then going to go grab the link element by typing link, and you'll see VS Code automatically gives me the rel attribute with the value of style sheet, and that's because it's the most commonly one used. Now for href, we need to go grab the app.css file. Now because app.css is on the same level inside this working directory, we can just grab it by typing app.css. So let's check this out in the browser. So you can see in our index page, our styles have been applied. Our h1 is blue and 50 pixels, and both our paragraphs are red and 30 pixels. If I head over to the download page, you can see none of the styles are being applied. And that's because we haven't yet linked our central style sheet to the download page. So all I'm going to do is copy this link line of code, head over to download.html, and paste it in the head. I'm also just going to quickly add a paragraph here, so you can see that those styles are also being applied. So let's refresh the page, and you can see the styles are being applied. The blue 50 pixel heading, and the red 30 pixel paragraph text. If I go back, you can see the same styles. So I now have one location where our CSS rules are being applied. So now let's say I wanted to update the color of my h1 from blue to green. I just come here and write green. And if I refresh the page, you can see our heading is now green on the index page and on the download page. So now, as you can imagine, if you had hundreds of pages, they're all going to be linking back to this central file. So that is why external CSS is the way to go. Let's now finish off the summary card for this topic, an introduction to CSS. We looked at the 3 different methods for including CSS. First, we looked at inline CSS, which was achieved using a style attribute inside an HTML tag. This wasn't good practice because you had to duplicate every single style for every single tag. The second method we looked at was internal CSS, where we used style tags inside the head of the HTML and defined a CSS rule. This was also not good practice because in this method we had to replicate the same style tags for multiple pages. We then looked at external CSS by introducing a link tag within the head section of an HTML page that referenced the style sheet. In this example file of index.html, the href attribute links to a CSS named app.css, where our styles are defined. In the app.css file, the color attribute for h1 is set to blue, allowing for consistent styling across the project and centralized management of styles. This method is considered best practice among the 3 discussed, as styles are defined in one central location. Great work! We've now finished an introduction to CSS. In the next topic, we'll be taking a deep dive into CSS text, and we'll learn about an array of CSS text properties, as well as some CSS fundamentals, like aligning and sizing elements, as well as managing colors. Also make sure to subscribe to the channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the next video.